The silence in Alara's small living room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Dust motes danced in the sliver of afternoon sun, slicing through the blinds, illuminating the framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture taken almost 15 years ago, a vibrant memory frozen in time. Alara, beaming, her arm around a bright-eyed young woman, Lily, her daughter. Their faces were pressed close, a testament to a bond that once felt unbreakable. But time, like a relentless tide, had eroded that connection, leaving behind only the sharp edges of resentment. The rift began subtly, a growing chasm of differing dreams and unspoken expectations. Lily, a spirited and ambitious soul, had always yearned for a life beyond their quiet town. A life Alara, rooted deeply in tradition and family, could neither understand nor endorse. The final break came with Lily's decision to accept a coveted job offer halfway across the world, a move Alara perceived as an ultimate abandonment, especially when her own aging father, Lily's grandfather, had just received a difficult diagnosis. Alara had pleaded, argued, even wept, but Lily's resolve was firm. "My life, mother," she had said, her voice tight with a newfound independence Alara saw as cold disregard. That single decision had calcified into a wall of stone between them, reinforced by years of unanswered calls, ignored letters, and the searing. The silence between them was a monument, built not of stone, but of years of unspoken words, of resentments carefully nurtured in separate hearts. Sarah would often catch herself staring at the empty chair across the dining table, a phantom limb of her childhood, where her father, Robert, once sat. It had been nearly 2 decades since she last heard his voice, not in anger, but in what she remembered as cold, unyielding disappointment. A misunderstanding, a youthful rebellion misconstrued as betrayal, had fractured their bond beyond what she thought repairable. Every family gathering, every holiday, was a stark reminder of his absence, an aching void that no amount of present laughter could truly fill. Her mother, bless her soul, had tried over the years, gentle nudges, wistful sighs, but Sarah's pride was a fortress, impenetrable and unwavering. She'd built her life, her career, her own small family, all without the blessing or even acknowledgement of the man who gave her life. This anger, this deeply ingrained hurt, had become a part of her identity, a shield against further pain. Yet sometimes, late at night, a flicker of doubt would pierce through the hardened resolve. Was she truly free, or was she a prisoner of her own unforgiveness? The thought would vanish with the morning light, replaced by the familiar ache and the conviction that she was justified. Robert had made his choice, she told herself. He had chosen his pride over his daughter, and she would not be the first to break. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of the wait, tired of the ghost that sat at her table, even when she was alone. The path to true freedom often begins with a single step, a willingness to reconsider what we believe to be unchangeable. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of unforgiveness or yearned for reconciliation in your own life, know that you're not alone. Our stories are meant to inspire, to show that healing is possible. Subscribe to our channel to join a community seeking peace and understanding, and to ensure you don't miss a single part of this journey. The incident itself, in hindsight, seemed so trivial to outsiders. A borrowed car, a late return, a broken headlight, an honest mistake, Sarah maintained. But her father, Robert, saw it differently. He saw a pattern of irresponsibility, a disregard for rules, a challenge to his authority. His words, delivered in a low, controlled tone, had cut deeper than any shout. "You are proving exactly what I feared, Sarah. Untrustworthy, disrespectful." Those words, more than the grounding or the strict new curfew, had become the barbed wire around her heart. She remembered the old photo lay on Sophia's bedside table, a silent accuser. It was a picture of her, barely 7, perched on her mother Elena's shoulders, both beaming, their faces alight with a joy that now felt like a cruel mirage. That joy had shattered years ago, fractured by a misunderstanding so profound it had ripped their world apart. Sophia had clung to her anger like a lifeline in a stormy sea. convinced she was the wronged one. Every missed holiday, every unheard birthday wish, every silent anniversary of their estrangement served as fresh fuel for the resentment that had built a formidable wall between them. She'd convinced herself that Elena simply didn't care, that her mother's supposed abandonment had been a deliberate act of cruelty, an unfeeling dismissal of her daughter's fragile heart. The silence had become a suffocating blanket, heavy and cold, preventing any warmth from penetrating her carefully constructed defenses. She remembered countless nights, staring at that photo, tears silently carving paths through the dust on its frame, wishing for a different past, a different mother, a different outcome to the argument that had changed everything. Yet, even in her deepest pain, a flicker of doubt sometimes sparked, an unsettling question about what Elena truly felt, what her side of the story might be, a thought quickly suppressed by the fierce grip of her enduring hurt. Sophia often replayed the scene in her mind, the day the chasm first opened. She was 16, a whirlwind of adolescent angst and nascent independence. Her father had left them a few months prior, and the house felt like a mausoleum of broken promises and unspoken grief. Elena, usually so vibrant, had retreated into herself, her eyes often vacant, her spirit diminished. Sophia, needing her mother's strength more than ever, had only found what felt like indifference. One evening, after a particularly harsh argument about Sophia's grades and perceived lack of effort, Sophia had hurled words like sharpened stones. "You don't care about me. You never did. You only care about yourself, just like Dad." Elena had flinched, a raw wound exposed, and her voice, usually steady, had cracked as she retorted, "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for you, Sophia. No idea." The words hung heavy in the air, loaded with a pain Sophia was too young and too angry to comprehend. She'd stormed out, convinced she was right, convinced her mother's pain was merely a selfish shield. The memory of her mother's trembling lower lip, the sudden pallor of her face, sometimes surfaced, unsettling Sophia, but she quickly pushed it down, reinforcing her narrative of victimhood and her mother's culpability. The years following only solidified this conviction, each passing day without a genuine apology from Elena feeling like another confirmation of her perceived abandonment. Elena, in her own quiet corner of the city, bore the weight of that same memory, but from a different vantage point. For her, Sophia's accusations had been a brutal punch to an already bruised soul. Her husband's departure had left her financially precarious and emotionally shattered. Fighting a silent battle with depression, she felt too ashamed to reveal to her headstrong daughter. Every late night working extra shifts, every sacrificed personal desire, every tear shed in private when Sophia was asleep, had been for her daughter's future, for a stability she desperately wanted to provide. When Sophia had lashed out, accusing her of not caring, it had felt like a complete betrayal, a dismissal of her entire being. The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving an ache that decades couldn't soothe. She had tried to reach out in the early years, timid phone calls unanswered, letters returned unopened. Each rejection had solidified her own pride, her conviction that Sophia needed to understand the truth, to see her mother's sacrifices. She believed she had done her best, and to be so cruelly judged by the one person she had poured her life into was a burden too heavy to openly carry. The silence that followed was not her choice, but a consequence, she felt, of Sophia's unyielding anger, a barrier she didn't know how to dismantle without losing the last shreds of her dignity. She often wondered if Sophia ever truly knew the depth of her struggles during that time, if she ever questioned the easy narrative of a mother who simply didn't care. The estrangement had cast a long, cold shadow over both their lives. For Sophia, holidays became a hollow charade, spent with friends or distant relatives, always with a nagging emptiness. Birthdays felt less like celebrations and more like milestones of separation, each year marking another cycle of unspoken words and unresolved grief. She saw other daughters laughing with their mothers, sharing secrets, offering comfort, and a bitter envy would often coil in her stomach. The void left by Elena's absence was not something she could easily fill, despite her outwardly successful career and seemingly full social life. Beneath the surface, there was a persistent ache, a wound that refused to heal. She'd learned to compartmentalize her pain, to present a polished, unaffected exterior. But alone in the quiet hours, the loneliness was palpable. She sometimes imagined what it would be like to call her mother, to hear her voice, but the imagined conversation always ended in awkward silence or renewed argument, reinforcing her belief that reconciliation was a futile dream. The memory of her mother's stern words, the perceived lack of emotional support during her most vulnerable years, often crept back into her thoughts, solidifying the invisible walls she had so painstakingly erected around her heart. Elena, too, bore the brunt of their fractured relationship. Sophia was her only child, and the silence from her daughter felt like a constant, dull throb in her chest. Each Mother's Day passed with a quiet sigh, each Christmas a little dimmer without the anticipation of a daughter's visit. She'd watch families in the park, mothers and daughters sharing knowing glances, and a profound sadness would wash over her. She knew friends worried, offering gentle suggestions to reach out, but her pride, bruised and battered, refused to bend. She had tried, in her own way, in those early years, and had been met with a brick wall of silence. Now, the fear of another rejection, another confirmation of Sophia's unwavering anger, kept her locked in her own solitude. She yearned for connection, for the chance to explain, to express the depth of her love and her pain, but the words felt trapped, suffocated by years of unspoken grievances. The empty chair at her dining table, the quiet echo of her own footsteps in the house, were constant reminders of what she had lost, a future she had once envisioned filled with warmth and laughter. She often wondered if Sophia ever thought of her, if a flicker of regret ever crossed her daughter's mind, or if she was truly forgotten, deemed unworthy of a second glance. Years bled into decades, and the chasm between them seemed to widen, cemented by the sheer passage of time and the unspoken words. Their mutual Aunt Clara, a woman of immense patience and an even larger heart, had made it her personal mission to bridge the gap. She would call both Sophia and Elena regularly, offering updates on one to the other, subtly dropping hints of loneliness, of unspoken longing. "Your mother asked about your promotion, Sophia," she'd say gently, knowing it would plant a seed. Or to Elena, "Sophia's new baby is due soon, did you know?" These small acts of defiance against the silence sometimes stirred a flicker of curiosity, a momentary softening, but never enough to prompt direct contact. They both maintained their defenses, unwilling to be the first to truly surrender. Aunt Clara, however, understood the nature of their stubborn love. She knew that beneath the layers of pride and hurt, a deep maternal and filial bond still existed, tangled and bruised, but resilient. She believed that sometimes people needed a gentle nudge, not a shove, to remember the essence of what they had lost, to reflect on the cost of their long-standing estrangement. Aunt Clara's quiet interventions, though seemingly ineffective on the surface, were planting seeds in dry soil, waiting for the right rain to awaken them. One day, the weight of Sophia's unresolved past began to feel heavier than usual. She was expecting her first child, a daughter, and suddenly, the absence of her own mother became a gaping wound. The fear of repeating generational patterns, of passing on her own unresolved pain, was terrifying. She found herself staring at the ultrasound images, wondering how she could possibly guide her own child through life's complexities when she herself couldn't navigate the simplest, familial reconciliation. The joy of impending motherhood was tinged with a profound sadness, a yearning for the wisdom and comfort only a mother could provide. She imagined her daughter asking about her grandmother, and the thought of explaining the long silence filled her with dread and shame. The protective wall she had built around her heart began to show cracks, not from external pressure, but from the internal tremors of her own burgeoning maternal instincts. The realization dawned on her that she didn't just miss Elena, she needed her. This wasn't about her mother forgiving her, or her forgiving her mother anymore. It was about something deeper, something fundamental to her own identity and her future as a parent. This new life stirring within her was implicitly demanding a resolution, a healing that felt overdue. The internal conflict raged within Sophia. Her mind, conditioned by years of resentment, screamed justifications for her anger, reminding her of every perceived slight, every moment of hurt. Yet her heart, now softened by the impending arrival of her own child, yearned for peace, for connection. She pictured her daughter, years from now, looking at her with the same disappointment she had once harbored for Elena, and a shiver ran down her spine. Was she destined to repeat the cycle, to model resentment instead of reconciliation? The thought was unbearable. She tried to dismiss it, to bury it under work and preparations for the baby, but the quiet moments were relentless. Memories of Elena's laughter, her comforting embrace when Sophia was sick, the way she used to braid her hair, all these suppressed images began to resurface, tinged with a poignant sadness for what had been lost. She began to question her own narrative, her steadfast conviction that she was entirely blameless. Perhaps, in her teenage angst, she hadn't seen the full picture, hadn't understood the silent battles her mother was fighting. The perfect storm of fear, regret, and a nascent empathy began to brew within her, stirring an unfamiliar desire for understanding. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, a quiet whisper in her soul that grew louder each day, Sophia found herself attending a small community church. It wasn't her usual habit. She hadn't stepped foot in a place of worship in years, not since her parents' separation. But Aunt Clara had mentioned this particular elder, known for his calming presence and insightful sermons, and Sophia, desperate for some semblance of peace, decided to go. She slipped into a back pew, hoping to be unnoticed, the unfamiliar hymns washing over her, feeling both alien and strangely comforting. She sat, lost in thought, the familiar ache of her past still lingering, wondering if she was truly ready to confront the ghosts of her own making. The elder began to speak, his voice gentle but firm, carrying a wisdom that resonated deep within the old wooden beams of the church. He spoke of burdens, of the invisible chains we forge for ourselves when we refuse to let go, when we cling to grievances as if they are precious possessions. His words were simple yet profound, cutting through Sophia's practiced cynicism with an unexpected clarity, paving the way for a message she desperately needed to hear. The elder's sermon began to unfold, slowly at first, then gaining momentum, each word a soft rain on Sophia's hardened heart. He spoke of the impermanence of life, of moments lost and never reclaimed, of the fragile thread that connects us all. We hold on to anger, he mused, his gaze sweeping over the congregation, as if it protects us, but in truth, it binds us. It keeps us tethered to a past that no longer serves us, blinding us to the present and stealing our future joy. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, feeling as though his words were directed solely at her, peeling back layers of carefully constructed indifference. He continued, "Forgiveness is not about condoning the offense. It is about releasing yourself from the prison of resentment. It is a gift you give to yourself, a liberation of your own spirit." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Forgive before the clock closes the day," he said, his words barely audible, yet resounding with an ancient truth. Because tomorrow is not promised, and some words, once left unsaid, can echo in silence for an eternity. The gravity of his statement settled over Sophia like a heavy cloak, chilling her to the bone. It was a stark reminder of the finite nature of time, of opportunities that, once gone, are lost forever. Those words, "Forgive before the clock closes the day," struck Sophia with the force of a physical blow. They echoed in the silent corners of her mind, a relentless drumbeat against her carefully constructed wall of justifications. She felt a profound unease, a gnawing sensation that had nothing to do with her baby and everything to do with her mother. The elder's message wasn't about whether Elena deserved forgiveness. It was about Sophia's own freedom, her own liberation. The idea that she was the one imprisoned, not Elena, was a radical shift in perspective that shook her to her core. All these years, she had viewed her anger as a righteous shield, protecting her from further hurt. Now, she saw it as a self-imposed cage, built brick by painful brick, trapping her in a cycle of bitterness and regret. The sermon ended, and Sophia rose, her legs feeling strangely heavy, her mind reeling. She walked out of the church into the crisp autumn air, the vibrant colors of the changing leaves a stark contrast to the barren landscape of her internal world. The world around her seemed to shimmer with a new, unsettling clarity. She knew, with an undeniable certainty, that something had to change. The question was, did she possess the courage to dismantle a lifetime of resentment? The path ahead felt daunting, fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time in years, the thought of reconciliation didn't feel like surrender, but a desperate, urgent necessity. The elder's words haunted Sophia through the following days, weaving themselves into her dreams and reflections. Each time she considered reaching out to Elena, a familiar resistance would rise. But she hurt me. She never apologized. Why should I be the one to extend the olive branch? Her pride, a stubborn companion for so long, whispered doubts and arguments, reminding her of every perceived injustice. The thought of reopening old wounds, of facing possible rejection, filled her with a profound dread. What if Elena didn't want to forgive her? What if the chasm was too wide to bridge? The fear of vulnerability, of putting her heart on the line only to have it broken again, was almost paralyzing. Yet beneath the fear and the lingering anger, a new voice had begun to emerge, softer, more insistent. It was the voice of peace, of longing for connection, amplified by the innocent heartbeat within her. She knew deep down that this journey wasn't for Elena alone, but for herself, for the daughter she was about to bring into the world. She needed to break this cycle, to show her child what it meant to heal, to model the courage of vulnerability. The image of the elder's gentle yet resolute face, repeating, "Forgive before the clock closes the day," became a powerful internal push, urging her to find a way to silence the clamor of her past and listen to the quiet urging of her heart. One particularly restless night, Sophia dreamt of her grandmother, a woman whose gentle wisdom had always been a source of comfort. In the dream, her grandmother held her hand, her eyes filled with a familiar love, and simply said, "Sometimes, darling, the hardest step is just the first. But imagine the view once you climb." Sophia awoke with a start, the words echoing in her mind. It was a sign, she felt, a confirmation of the path she needed to take. The next morning, she picked up her phone, her hand trembling. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger hovering over Elena's name, a name she hadn't dialed in over a decade. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, rehearsing what she would say, how she would manage the inevitable awkwardness, the potential for yet another misunderstanding. The weight of years of silence pressed down on her, almost physically preventing her from pressing the call button. But then, the image of her future daughter, her innocent face full of hope, flashed in her mind, and Sophia knew she couldn't allow her pride to win this battle. This was not just for her. It was for the legacy of healing she wished to leave. With a surge of newfound resolve, she pressed the button, sending the call into the ether, hoping against hope that her mother would answer. The phone rang twice, then 3 times, each ring a hammer blow to Sophia's anxious heart. Just as she was about to give up, to let the familiar sting of rejection settle in, a hesitant voice answered. "Hello?" It was Elena, her voice thin, uncertain, tinged with a surprise that was almost palpable. Sophia's throat tightened. The carefully rehearsed words vanished, replaced by a sudden rush of emotion. "Mom?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unshed tears. A beat of stunned silence followed. Then Elena's voice, stronger this time, laced with disbelief. "Sophia? Is that really you?" The sound of her mother's voice, after all these years, was like a balm and a shock simultaneously. It brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad, swirling in a confusing mix of relief and renewed pain. A fragile bridge had just been extended across the chasm, but Sophia knew the true journey of crossing it had only just begun. The initial contact, a tiny spark in the vast darkness, had been made. Now came the daunting task of nurturing that spark, of fanning it into a flame that could melt the ice of decades of resentment. The simple act of speaking her mother's name and hearing it in return had already begun to loosen the grip of the past, making the next steps feel both terrifying and profoundly necessary. The initial conversation was halting, riddled with awkward pauses and polite, almost superficial questions about health and weather. They danced around the elephant in the room, the decade of silence, the unaddressed wounds. Sophia spoke of her pregnancy, and she heard a subtle shift in Elena's tone, a softening, a hint of genuine warmth. Elena, in turn, shared updates about Aunt Clara, about the garden she had cultivated, small fragments of a life Sophia had been excluded from. It was clear both women were treading carefully, testing the waters, unsure of how much honesty the other could bear. Sophia felt a mix of hope and frustration. Hope, because her mother had answered, because her voice sounded less guarded than she'd imagined. Frustration, because the real issues, the deep-seated hurts, remained untouched, looming unspoken between them. Yet, the very act of speaking, of hearing each other's voices, was a breakthrough in itself. It was a subtle acknowledgement that the connection, however frayed, still existed, and perhaps, with enough courage and vulnerability, it could be rewoven. The conversation ended with a tentative promise of another call, a small thread of connection that Sophia clung to, a glimmer of light in the long-held darkness. Over the next few weeks, the phone calls became more frequent, gradually shedding their initial awkwardness. They still hadn't addressed the past directly, but they were slowly, tentatively reconnecting on the surface. Sophia found herself sharing details about her pregnancy, the excitement and anxieties, and listened as Elena offered gentle advice, sometimes even a quiet laugh. These were small, hesitant steps, but each one felt monumental. Elena, too, seemed to be opening up, sharing a little more about her daily life, her quiet joys, and the solitude she had grown accustomed to. Sophia began to see glimpses of the mother she remembered, the strong, caring woman who had once been her anchor. The layers of resentment she had built up over the years began to chip away, exposing a raw vulnerability she hadn't realized was still there. The conversations were like cautious explorations of a forgotten landscape, each word a tentative footfall. They were building a new foundation, piece by painful piece, knowing that the real difficult work of addressing the past still lay ahead. Yet, with each passing call, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose, a growing belief that the chasm could indeed be bridged. One afternoon, a few days before her due date, Sophia mustered all her courage. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling slightly, would you mind coming to visit before the baby arrives? There's so much I want to talk about, so much I need to say." There was a long pause on the other end, so long that Sophia's heart sank, fearing she had pushed too hard, too fast. Then, Elena's voice, soft but clear. "Yes, Sophia. I think that's a very good idea. I'd like that very much." The relief that washed over Sophia was immense, a tidal wave that almost brought her to tears. It was an unspoken invitation to finally confront the past, to lay bare the unspoken grievances that had festered for so long. The fear remained, a tight knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful surge of hope. This wasn't just a visit. It was a pilgrimage, a journey they both needed to undertake to heal old wounds and forge a new beginning. The thought of Elena in her home, on her terms, ready to engage in a conversation that was decades overdue, felt both terrifying and undeniably right. It was the moment of truth, the opportunity to finally follow the elders' whispered advice, to forgive before the clock truly closed on their chance. Elena arrived a few days later, a small suitcase in hand, her face a mixture of apprehension and relief. The air in Sophia's apartment was thick with unspoken history. The initial hug was tentative, almost formal, a cautious embrace after years of separation. They sat in the living room, a silence stretching between them that was heavier than any words. Sophia cleared her throat, her heart pounding. "Mom," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. For the things I said, for the way I treated you when I was younger. I didn't understand." "I didn't see your pain." Elena's eyes, which had been fixed on her hands, slowly lifted to meet Sophia's. A tear traced a path down her cheek. "Oh, Sophia," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have explained. I should have told you what I was going through. I was so lost after your father left, so broken, and I didn't know how to be strong for both of us." The floodgates had opened, not with anger, but with a shared river of sorrow and understanding. It was the first crack in the dam of their prolonged silence, a moment of raw, unvarnished honesty that felt both excruciating and profoundly cathartic. The years of resentment began to crumble, giving way to a nascent understanding that had been buried under layers of pride and misunderstanding. As the initial confessions tumbled out, a strange calm settled over them. Elena spoke of the overwhelming grief and financial strain after the divorce, of her silent battles with depression and how she had felt utterly alone, desperate to protect Sophia from her own unraveling. She admitted that her withdrawal had been a desperate attempt to keep herself from breaking entirely, not a dismissal of her daughter's needs. Sophia, in turn, recounted her teenage vulnerability, the fear of losing another parent, and how her anger had been a misplaced cry for attention and reassurance. She confessed the deep-seated belief that Elena had chosen her own sorrow over her daughter, a misunderstanding born of her youthful inability to see beyond her own pain. Tears flowed freely from both of them, not tears of sadness, but of release, of years of pent-up emotion finally finding an outlet. Each revelation, each acknowledgement of the other's pain, chipped away at the wall that had divided them, replacing it with a fragile but genuine bridge of empathy. The truth, in its rawest form, was not a weapon, but a balm, slowly soothing the wounds they had both carried in isolation for so long. The complexity of their human experience, finally laid bare, revealed two individuals who had suffered, each in their own way, under the weight of silent assumptions. The conversation continued for hours, spanning the trajectory of their fractured relationship. They revisited old arguments, not to relitigate them, but to offer context and understanding, to finally fill in the blanks that years of silence had left. Elena explained the true depth of her sacrifices, the jobs she'd taken, the dreams she'd deferred, all for Sophia's future, a truth Sophia had dismissed in her youthful indignation. Sophia apologized again, this time with a deeper, more mature understanding, acknowledging the immense pressure Elena must have been under. She recounted the loneliness of her own journey, the constant ache of her mother's absence, and the profound regret that had plagued her, especially with her own impending motherhood. There were no grand gestures, no sudden dramatic Hollywood-style reconciliation. It was quiet, painstaking, and deeply emotional work, punctuated by shared memories that brought both laughter and fresh tears. The air gradually lightened, the unspoken tension slowly dissolving. The bitterness that had clung to Sophia's heart for so long began to give way to a profound sense of relief, a realization that the burdens she had carried were finally being laid down. This honest reckoning, though painful, was cleansing, washing away years of accumulated resentment. The resolution that emerged was not a magical erasure of the past, but an honest acceptance of it. There were no perfect apologies, no flawless explanations that absolved all fault. Instead, there was a mutual acknowledgement of hurt, a genuine understanding of individual struggles, and a shared desire to move forward. Elena expressed regret not for her choices, but for her inability to communicate her struggles to Sophia, to help her daughter understand. Sophia, in turn, offered a heartfelt apology for her immaturity and judgmental nature, recognizing the impossible position her mother had been in. They found common ground in their shared pain and their shared love. The years of resentment, while not forgotten, were finally unburdened of their destructive power. The wall between them hadn't crumbled entirely, but a large, sturdy gate had been built, wide open for passage. It was a realistic ending, not a storybook one, reflecting the messy, complicated reality of human relationships. But within that reality, a profound healing had begun, paving the way for a future where misunderstanding could be met with dialogue and love could finally overcome the stubborn grip of pride. The peace in the room was palpable, a testament to the power of truth spoken in vulnerability. In the days that followed, a fragile but beautiful new chapter began to unfold. Elena stayed with Sophia, helping her prepare for the baby's arrival. They cooked together, shared quiet meals, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence, a luxury they hadn't known in years. Sophia found herself confiding in Elena about her fears of motherhood, and Elena, now unburdened by her own past secrets, offered not just advice, but genuine empathy and reassurance. They discovered new layers to each other, bridging the gaps left by lost. The silence that followed the elder's words was not empty, but heavy with the weight of decades. Clara felt it pressing down on her, an invisible burden she hadn't realized she was carrying until that moment. Forgive before the clock closes the day. The phrase echoed, not as a command, but as a gentle yet firm invitation. She thought of her father, Robert, and the chasm that had formed between them since her mother's passing, a chasm she had helped build brick by painful brick. Anger, a familiar companion, still simmered beneath the surface, whispering doubts, reminding her of every perceived slight, every missed birthday, every unanswered call. It felt justified, righteous even, to hold on to that pain. But the elder's gaze had held a wisdom that transcended her anger, a profound understanding of the human heart's capacity for both hurt and healing. Could she truly let go? Could she dismantle the fortress she had built around her heart, not for him, but for herself? The thought was terrifying, yet exhilarating. It was not about forgetting the past, she realized, but about preventing it from defining her future. The afternoon sun, filtering through the stained glass window, seemed to warm her face, a silent promise of new beginnings if she only dared to reach for them. This wasn't about him earning her forgiveness. It was about her earning her own peace. The next morning, the words still resonated, prompting an unusual restlessness within Clara. She found herself pacing her small apartment, a forgotten cup of coffee growing cold on the counter. The familiar routine felt alien, overshadowed by the enormity of what she was contemplating. Forgiveness. It felt less like a choice and more like a calling, a quiet, insistent voice urging her to brave the uncomfortable. She knew her father lived only a few towns away, but the distance between their hearts felt like continents. Picking up the phone felt like lifting a mountain. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, trembling slightly. What would she even say? After years of silence, punctuated only by strained pleasantries at distant family gatherings, how do you begin to mend something so profoundly broken? The fear of rejection was palpable, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny spark of hope flickered. It was the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he felt a similar longing for connection, for closure. It wasn't about absolving him, she reminded herself again, but about freeing herself from the shackles of resentment. Taking a deep breath, she dialed. The ringing tone felt like an eternity. The elder's words, "Forgive before the clock closes the day," echoed in David's mind, a constant, nagging whisper that wouldn't be silenced. He sat on his porch, staring at the fading light, the same light that had painted the sky on countless evenings he'd spent estranged from his sister, Clara. Their argument, years ago, over their mother's will, had festered into a chasm of silence, each year adding another layer of stone to its walls. He remembered the fury, the sense of betrayal, the conviction that he was in the right. But what had that conviction brought him? Only an unbearable hollowness that grew with every passing holiday, every milestone unshared. The pride that had fueled his anger now felt like a heavy chain, dragging him down. He'd seen Clara at a distance a few times, at community events, but they'd always avoided eye contact, their shared past a ghost haunting the periphery. He longed for the days when their laughter filled their childhood home, when they were a team, united against the world. He knew she felt the pain too. He could see it in the brief, accidental glances, a reflection of his own sorrow. The elder hadn't just spoken of forgiveness, he'd spoken of freedom, a liberation that David desperately craved. He imagined reaching out, the fear of rejection a tangible thing, yet the alternative, a life lived perpetually in the shadow of regret, was even more terrifying. The clock was indeed closing the day, and with it, perhaps, his last chance at peace. The weight of the unsaid words pressed down on David, making it hard to breathe. He thought about the small, almost insignificant details of their last true conversation, not the angry exchange, but the one before it, full of easy camaraderie and shared dreams. He remembered Clara's laugh, a bright melodic sound that could always lighten his mood. Now, that memory was tinged with a deep ache, a realization of how much had been lost to stubbornness and miscommunication. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact. It felt like an impossible act, a betrayal of the anger he'd held onto for so long. Every fiber of his being screamed caution, reminding him of the perceived injustices, the harsh words exchanged. Yet another voice, softer but insistent, spoke of the elders' wisdom, of the fleeting nature of time and the preciousness of connection. He envisioned their mother, looking down on them, surely heartbroken by their divide. What good was being right if it meant being alone? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, a vivid reminder of the day closing. He knew he couldn't let another day end without at least trying to bridge the gap. The fear of failure was immense, but the fear of never trying was greater. This wasn't just about Clara, it was about him, about shedding the burden that had weighed him down for years. It was about choosing peace over pride, love over anger, before it was too late. He took a deep breath, the decision firming in his chest. With a trembling hand, David finally pressed call. The phone rang, each tone a hammer against his anxious heart. What would he say? How would she react? Would she hang up? Would she lash out? He had no script, only an overwhelming urge to confess his weariness of the silence, his longing for their connection. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 rings, Clara's voice, tentative and a little shaky, answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice betraying a mix of surprise and apprehension. David's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The years of resentment and unspoken pain choked him. He could almost hear the doubt creeping into her voice as she repeated, "Hello? David, is that you?" He had to push past the knot of fear and apprehension. This was it, the moment of truth. "Clara," he managed to rasp, his voice raw with emotion. "It's me, David. I just needed to hear your voice." The air between them crackled with unspoken history, with the weight of their fractured past. He could almost hear her holding her breath, waiting for the accusation, the familiar anger, but there was none. Only a desperate plea for connection, for a chance to heal what had been broken. The first step was taken, terrifying and uncertain, yet undeniably real. A long silence followed David's choked confession, stretching taut between them. He braced himself for rejection, for the sharp retort he felt he probably deserved. But instead, Clara's voice, when it finally came, was soft, tinged with a fragility he hadn't heard in years. "David," she whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. I wasn't expecting your call." Her words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, layered with a surprise that mirrored his own. He heard a slight catch in her breath, and a fragile hope began to bloom in his chest. "I know," he said, finding his voice a little stronger now. "And I understand if you don't want to talk, but I couldn't let another day pass without trying." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that could bridge the chasm. "I've been carrying this burden for so long, Clara. This anger, this stubborn pride. It's been heavier than I ever imagined, and I'm just so tired of it." He poured out his heart, not making excuses, not blaming her, but simply admitting his own exhaustion with the conflict. He spoke of the elders' words, of the profound truth he'd found in them. He spoke of missing her, of the emptiness their estrangement had left in his life. He felt a cleansing wave wash over him as the words tumbled out, raw and honest. As David continued to speak, pouring out the anguish of years of separation, Clara listened intently. He confessed his faults, his stubbornness, his inability to see past his own pain. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, not yet, but simply laid bare his heart, hoping she would understand the depth of his regret. He spoke of lonely holidays, of moments when he yearned to share a simple memory with her, only to remember the bitter silence between them. He spoke of the emptiness that had settled in his life, an emptiness that no amount of pride could fill. On the other end of the line, Clara remained silent for a long moment after he finished, and David's heart pounded in his chest, fearing he had pushed too hard, too fast. Then he heard a sniffle, and a soft, trembling voice cut through the silence. "Oh, David," she whispered, her voice breaking. I felt it too. Every single word you said, I felt it. The anger, the emptiness. I thought I was strong enough to just forget, but I couldn't. Not really." Tears began to flow freely, on both ends of the phone line. Not tears of renewed anger, but tears of release, of shared grief for the lost years, and an overwhelming sense of relief that the wall between them was finally crumbling. Can we talk more?" she managed, her voice still shaky but imbued with a nascent hope that resonated deep within David's soul. Can we meet?" That afternoon, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the park, David saw Clara approaching. Her steps were tentative, and her eyes, though a little red from crying, held a vulnerability he hadn't seen in years. He felt his own eyes well up again. There was no need for grand gestures or eloquent speeches. As they drew closer, their gaze met, and in that shared look, years of hurt, misunderstanding, and stubborn pride dissolved. All that remained was the raw, undeniable bond of family, of two souls yearning for connection. Clara took a hesitant step forward, and then another. David mirrored her movement, and then, without a single word, they simply fell into each other's arms. It was a tight embrace, clumsy and tearful, but infused with the weight of all the missed moments, all the unspoken apologies, all the love that had been buried beneath layers of anger. The elder's words, "Forgive before the clock closes the day," replayed in David's mind, and he understood their profound truth. In that embrace, the clock had indeed stopped, not closing the day, but opening a new one. It was a liberation, a release, a peace that he hadn't known was possible. The warmth of her hug, the gentle pat on his back, were more powerful than any words could ever be. He was free. He was home. This journey reminds us of a fundamental truth. Who forgives themselves finds freedom even before receiving forgiveness. It's a liberation of the spirit, a shedding of the heavy burden of resentment. If you felt the weight of unforgiveness, remember that the choice to let go is always yours, and it's the first step towards a deeper, more peaceful existence. Don't wait for tomorrow. Begin your journey of healing today. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it to inspire others, or leave a comment with your thoughts on the power of forgiveness.